Hello everyone, I'm Diane Woodworth. I'm the education consultant for Wawasee Construction. And so I'd like to welcome everyone to the second episode of our K-12 Corner podcast, which is produced by Wawasee Construction. Today I'm joined by Steve Troyer, Dr. Steve Troyer, who's a superintendent here at Wawasee Community Schools. And I'm a retired superintendent, by the way. So welcome, Steve. It's great to talk with you today.
Yeah, thank you, Diane. I appreciate the opportunity. We were just mentioning here a few minutes ago that you and I go way back.
Yes, we do.
Even to the point where I was a student under your leadership at
That's right.
at Northridge High School. So it's good to be sitting down with you and connecting as colleagues once again. I appreciate the chance to get to talk to you.
Thank you, and the feeling's mutual. I really enjoy doing this, and it's fun to have you as a colleague.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Well, our topic today is transparency in K-12 education, with our communities and our stakeholders. So I guess I would just like to start off by asking you a little bit about what is your take on the transparency issues that K-12 is facing today?
Yeah, honestly, it's a really big challenge, not just for us, but for everybody. I really think that's one of the buzzwords that you hear a lot, and in my mind, it's kind of like communication. You can never be transparent enough, and I think people are clamoring for transparency, not only because we're a governmental entity, we're a tax-supported entity, so there's always things people want to see what you're doing with tax dollars, but I think even more than that now. There's this real interest from the public and from parents about, what are you teaching our children? What kinds of materials are you putting in front of them? What kinds of things are they accessing in libraries? And people want to really, they want to understand and they want to know that the materials and the teaching methods and the way that you're going about instructing kids aligns with community values. And because of that, I think there's this even more interest in being transparent than there ever has been, not just financially, but also on the curriculum side of things, on the instructional side of things in the classroom. So it's a big topic and a big issue that all schools are dealing with right now, and we're having to find ways to make sure that people feel comfortable with the work that we're doing. And part of that is being really intentional about communication and about what it is that you're putting out there for people to see. They want to be able to feel like that's accessible to them and that information is available so they can take a look at it and kind of sign off that they feel good about that. So we're being really intentional about the information that we're putting out. We try and communicate that. That isn't something that we've always done the best job at, but we continue to strive to be better at because it is becoming increasingly important for people. So an example of that, we were just talking about here a little bit ago. We've just started doing a board summary that we put out after each of our board meetings. Our first one, when I say just started, November board meeting was the first one we put one of these summaries out. But we sent it out to all of our staff. And then also we made that available not only on our website, but we posted it on our social media. And we're looking for ways that we can get that out into the community. The community doesn't always interact with our website or social media. So we want to be able to intentionally push that out so that people can see what is the work that the board is doing, what's the business that they're covering, and then what are some of the big issues that the schools are taking under consideration and working on so that we can get our message out there. Because in an effort to really be as transparent as possible, it takes intentionality on our part. And I think some strategic planning on our part to get that information out there. So
I really agree. It doesn't just happen unless you are intentional about it.
Yeah, and you've got to think about it ahead of time because it's so easy for you to. We're not typically education people aren't trained to think about all the communication steps that need to fall in line for a decision. We're focused on what's happening in the classroom. How does this impact kids? How does this impact our families? Quite oftentimes we don't think about, oh, hey, we need to involve this group of people in this conversation. We need to make sure that our stakeholders out in the community know what we're doing. We need to make sure that the parents are aware of that. And all that takes strategic planning from a communication standpoint. I think when you communicate well, then that transparency piece feels as if it's there. Often when people feel like, hey, there's a lack of transparency on behalf of the district or on behalf of a school, it's a communication issue. And so we really try to be strategic in how we communicate, and that helps people to feel like, hey, they're opening the doors, they're opening the books, they're opening the curriculum to make sure that they understand what we're putting out there.
Totally agree. And so on that note, I'm curious if you've had any feedback now. You just put your board summary out for the first time. So did you have any feedback yet?
Yeah, it's been really positive actually. We just hired a communications director here within the last couple of months. It's been something that has been priority for me for a couple of years since really I started in this position, and we were finally at a place with board support and with community support that they felt like, hey, now's the time we can bring this position into the mix. And actually just today, our communications director sent me an email just expressing really great support for the work that she's doing and trying to communicate and be intentional about the messaging that we're getting out there. So we're hearing really good things. She's kind of in the middle of working through a communications audit, so we know where we're at to help us plan for where we want to go. But it's been really positive so far, and I think people feel when the communication's good and the communication levels are high, then people feel good about their school. They feel positive about the things that they're seeing, whether that's on social media or direct communication with them as a parent or community member. But they also, there's just a general feeling of being in the know. And I think it's really important for schools, especially to make sure that people have that feeling, because it's one of the things that comes up all the time. And I tell our folks, you cannot communicate enough, and because there's always going to be somebody that feels like, hey, you could have communicated this better. We really try and be proactive about that instead of reactive. A lot of times we get in a position where somebody says, wow, I wish I would have known that before you did X, Y, Z. And that, for us, that's the last thing we want to hear. So we want to be intentional about it. And I've talked about this a little bit already, but it's really important to be strategic. Like you've got to strategize about how to make that happen.
So speaking of strategy and being intentional, one thing I really wanted to talk with you about today was the community engagement process that you used with your community. You talk about possible building needs, facilities needs. I know that this community had a failed referendum before you came into this seat. And so I think it's very interesting, and it was a very transparent process, it looked like, from the outside. So I'm curious to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about the referendum. You alluded to that. I believe November 2020 was our referendum. Talking about transparency, one of the big talking points in the community about that, especially in terms of negativity towards the referendum, was a lack of transparency. The referendum came about really quickly. The messaging was a little bit unclear, and people just didn't feel like they knew enough about what was happening with that. That then led to some really hard feelings in the community. So we were already kind of up against this this feeling of like, well, the school isn't being the district isn't being transparent enough with the community, especially, and when you throw something as significant as a referendum into the community, and they don't feel like that transparency was there, that puts you a little bit with your back up against the wall to begin with.
Right.
So that happened in November of 2020. I took over from our superintendent that retired in January of 21. And right away, some of the work that we had to do initially was like, how do we begin to address the narrative of the school being not transparent, and how do we communicate better and differently so that we can get the community kind of back on our side. And that wasn't to say that the community was completely against the district. There were a lot of things that the community did support, but they looked at everything critically. And so coming out of that, we had a lot of work to do, just in terms of being upfront and honest with the community about where we were going, what some big things were on the horizon for us. And one of those things was an issue that we had been grappling with at Wawasee for over 30 years, and that was us having 2 middle schools. So in our community, we have 3 elementary schools, and we had 1 middle school that served 2 of the 3 elementaries, and then we had another middle school that was part of a K-8 building. Unfortunately, the enrollment in that building had declined over the years to the point where we were at like 130 students in our middle school at that building, and it was becoming a disadvantage for kids that were attending that building to continue on. So we went forth and said, okay, now's the time that we really need to take a look at this issue. We held a meeting. It was during an August board meeting, so first board meeting of the year. That meeting also happened to, not by design, but it happened to fall on the back to school night. And so immediately then the community was like, hey, you guys are trying to talk about this really important thing when nobody's going to be there because everybody's at back to school night. That wasn't our intent, but it was just one of those things that lined up, and it was like, okay, we hear that. That wasn't great. We held a community meeting then in October, and the community meeting was very, very much against combining our 2 middle schools. In particular, the community from that middle school that would be losing a middle school was very against that. And some of those same talking points came back. You didn't communicate well about this. You weren't transparent about what you wanted to do. You're just doing this and not taking any input. And at that time, we had kind of planned to walk through a process where we would have this community meeting, we'd gather some input, the board would then make a decision in November or December about what they were going to do. The community spoke loud and clear and was like, hey, this isn't, you haven't gone about this the right way. So we took that to heart, honestly. We took a step back in talking with the board, and we announced that, hey, this didn't go the way that we had planned. Let's take a step back, have a reboot, and then we'll continue working on this. So we ended up getting together a group of people. It was about 50 people, just under 50 people, and we put together this group to be very representative of the community. And so we took people that were interested in serving on the group. We also handpicked some people that we felt like needed to be on the group because they were representative voices of their pockets of the people that they represented in the community. And we put together almost an equal division of people. So we have 3 towns in our district. Each of the 3 towns was almost equally represented. We had parents, we had teachers, we had civic leaders, we had a couple realtors, some clergy, we had business leaders in the community. It was really, we were really intentional about how we put together that group. And the one thing I would say is that, some people felt like, well, hey, if you select the group, then you're obviously going to just stack the deck in your favor. We were actually really intentional about putting people that opposed what we were talking about onto that group because we felt really strongly that we needed to hear all the voices, not just the voices that we were hoping to hear. That group also was tasked with more than just let's decide what we do with the middle schools. It was also, what are we going to do kind of strategically from a facilities perspective, from a educational programming perspective, as we look to the next 5 to 10 years. And so we had 5 different meetings, 1 meeting in each of our buildings. At each meeting, we did a tour of the facility because a lot of people haven't been in all 5 facilities. And so we did a tour at each one, and then we hosted like an information session in which we were able to present some information. So one of those focused on finances and bond capacity, because we had some debt capacity that was coming up in a window. So we talked about public school finance and how does that work. We also had a session in which we presented on our educational programming and what are we doing at each level and what are things that we want to do that we can't do because of our current situation. And then we had a demographics study that was done. So we had a session on the demographics study. We also had a facility study that was done. And so we had them come in and present on all of our facilities. We took all of this information then over the course of 5 weeks. In the last session, then we basically split this group out into smaller groups, and they put together what they felt like the board needed to consider as areas to address. And some of that was programming related, some of that was facilities related, some of that was related to the middle school.
Yeah.
I talked about our communications director. One of the things that was totally unintended that came out of this conversation was that people felt like we needed to communicate better and we need to have somebody in control or in charge of our communications. And so the fact that we were able to get that really came out of the community saying, hey, this is really important to us.
Right.
You guys need to do something about this. So we ended up going through this process, and we had people from the communities that were going to be impacted by this. And we were able to bring people together and basically say, this isn't what we want, but we know that this is what's best for kids. Or this isn't going to serve our own personal interests the best, but as a whole with the corporation, we feel like this is probably what we need to do. So coming out of that, we were able to then make a recommendation to the board to merge the 2 middle schools together. We didn't have any public opposition to that because of the fact that we walked through this process. People knew what was going on. They felt like they were informed. They felt like they were given the information to actually make it an informed, meaningful opinion about it. And we've honestly received nothing but great feedback on how that process went, but more importantly, the things that came out of that process moving down the line. In the summer, this past summer, we announced that we were going to merge the 2 middle schools together. We were going to do a new elementary school at the former site of the K-8 building. And we were going to do a significant addition to our high school with a new performing arts center and some CTE space that would be addressed in that as well, some space for alternative learning as well. So we're able to really come up with a plan not only to address the middle school scenario, but also then how do we address what our priorities are with facilities as we move forward. And I think as I've heard people talk, that whole transparency conversation has really started to shift, especially over the last couple of months. I've had people, even in our conversations out at Milford Elementary School where we've talked about the new building, people have come up and said, we really felt like for years the district was withholding information, and now we feel like you're giving us the information that we need to be informed community members. And that's been really powerful for us because we feel like, hey, there's actually some momentum building in a positive way that we're not communicating and being transparent perfectly. But we're really trying to move the needle forward on that and make some good decisions as it relates to getting information out to the public that they need.
Absolutely. I think that is a remarkable story. And I hope anybody who's watching this podcast takes it to heart if they've had a similar situation in their communities. So if any superintendents or board members would want to contact you, would that be okay with you?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I've actually talked to several people about our story and the work that we're doing. My assistant superintendent, Dr. Wilfong, and I gave a presentation at the ISBA conference,
Right.
and I've had a number of people follow up with me on that. This isn't to say that everything went perfectly. I started this story with saying, hey, we made some mistakes on the front end, and we thought this was going to go well, and it went really poorly. And how do we regroup from that? Just because some of those mistakes are made doesn't mean that, hey, you have to give up on it and that's the end of the road. We just needed to regroup and come up with a process that was going to be better suited for our patrons and our stakeholders to make sure that they felt like they were really a part of the process. And if that would have turned out differently than maybe what we were hoping for, what we were expecting, that would have been okay too. Sure. And we would have had to had the willingness to say, hey, the community has really spoken about this, and we need to go a different direction than what we were intending.
Right.
And that would have been a very real possibility for us that we were willing to accept.
Right.
And I think that's an important piece too. Like if you're going to ask people what they think, then you need to be prepared to take that feedback into consideration as you move forward on decisions.
Absolutely. But again, I think it's a great story, and it's hopefully a story of hope for other people who might be feeling discouraged, like this isn't going well. And I like that you were honest about that no, it didn't go well at the beginning, so we had to pull back and regroup. Yeah. And I think it's a great model, and people could beg, borrow, and steal pieces of your model, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and we don't own that process by any means. We actually worked with a consultant, Dr. Halleck from Compass Keynote Consulting, and Dr. Halleck kind of guided us through some of that process. I'm really appreciative of the work that he's done as my mentor, and he gave me a lot of those ideas. So we certainly don't want to take ownership of that, and we want to help anyone that has questions or wants to pick our brain about the process that we went through. We can tell you that it worked for us. Right. We can also tell you what didn't work for us.
Which is also important.
What did
not work,
Yeah, and I just think for our community, they've really embraced the way that we went about it. They have embraced the fact that they feel like they're much more in the know than what they have been in the past. Right. And that's the most important part. I mean, when it comes to that issue of transparency, I've said it a few different times. People have to feel like that you are giving them the information, that you're telling them the truth, and that they can therefore trust that the information that you're giving is right. And to me, I think that's as critical as anything. There are often times, especially with government, that people don't trust that the information they're getting is correct. Right. And that's something that we've had to overcome. And how do we do that? Well, we open it up wide open enough that people can come in and they can look and they can see for themselves that the information we have given them is correct, is accurate, and that they can verify that through the checks and balances that are available to the community. So that's been a huge part for us as we've kind of changed that narrative and it started to change the narrative, of the link between the district and the community as a whole.
And I think a key too, as I've listened to your story, and the reason I thought it would be okay if I mentioned that people could contact you is because I heard that presentation, ISBA, very well done, and I know you said that there, so that's why I felt free to say that in this podcast. All right, I think a key is that you're continuing the work of transparency, right? You just started the summary from your board meetings and you just put that out. So your community can see that you're very, indeed, transparent because you're continuing that work, right?
Yeah,
I think that's important.
And I think, you have to be, talked about intentionality, you have to be intentional about opening yourself up. And, it's easy for us to get in our grind, so to speak, the day-to-day grind, and not think about how does this look to, maybe not even an outsider, but how does this look to a parent who is in our district, or how does this look to a community member that has no affiliation to the district? And when they only see stuff perhaps on social media, or they may see a little snippet in the newspaper once a month,
Right.
That isn't enough to really capture a narrative of the work that's actually happening in the district. One of the things that we've discovered, for example, over the last month or so is that we've been doing a lot of highlighting of adults in the district. Community and parents want to see highlighting of kids.
Okay.
So that's been a shift for us.
Sure.
Even with our social media, like what is the cool stuff that kids are doing here
Right.
in the district? When they can see that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
then that again gives a feeling of transparency. Like you can actually see into the workings of the district because I can see what kids are actually doing in classrooms, on trips, with projects that they're working on,
Right.
and they can really get a sense of what is happening. And when you're able to show that kind of stuff, people feel so much better about the work that's happening in the district. So
Absolutely.
that's been a push for us.
Absolutely.
We're at the front end of this whole real focus on communication and transparency. And throughout my 3 years as superintendent at Wawasee, that's always been a priority for me. But now that we've got some other things in place, it allows us to really focus on that as one of our pillars that we want to lean on and that we want to emphasize, especially with the community that doesn't have that natural channel of communication to the school with. And so that work for us is really just beginning like as a real area of emphasis, even though it's been a priority for myself and for our team here for a number of years. We're actually putting some tangible things in place so that people can start to see that benefit.
Right. Perfect. I think it's critical, the work you're doing, and I really appreciate you being vulnerable today and telling us about it on this podcast. So thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Any final parting wisdom on this issue of transparency before we wrap this up?
No, I think that just to reiterate, it's incredibly important. It may be some of the most important work that you do. Obviously, it's not the mission critical work that happens with kids in the classroom, but that communication and transparency impacts that mission driven work that you're able to do. Despite you could be doing the greatest things in the world, and if you're not getting that message out there to people, and if you're not opening the doors and letting people see that in, they don't know that, and then it allows them to craft their narrative rather than us crafting that narrative for them.
Absolutely.
And we feel like we can do a really good job of telling our story in a positive way. So yeah, I would finish on that. I appreciate the chance to get to talk with you. It's exciting work that you're doing, and we're glad to be a part of that. So thank you.
No, thank you for your time. Dr. Steve Troyer, Wawasee Community Schools.